Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are producing this deep dive specifically for the ABENG signal, and today we are tuning into a frequency that I think is going to challenge how a lot of us visualize the Caribbean. We are looking at episode 3 of the series, Sevilla la Nueva, First Town, First Chains, covering the critical window from 1509 to 1534.
It is a really short window of time. I mean, only 25 years, but the shadow it casts is it's enormous.
Absolutely. And, usually when we talk about this period in history books, it's a footnote. It's a date on a timeline.
Yeah, you might get a sentence.
Right, maybe you get a sentence about Columbus's son or a mention of the ruins. But we are going to do something different today. We have a massive stack of sources here. Archaeological reports, historical analyses of the Encomienda system, medical history on tropical diseases, and the mission really is to look at this site from below.
From below, I like that. Meaning not from the perspective of the governor writing letters to the king, but from the perspective of the people dragging the stones.
Exactly. We are stripping away the tourist brochure version of history. So let's start right there. Let's start with the visual. If you go to Jamaica's north coast today, near St. Anne's Bay, you can visit the Seville Heritage Park. It's a beautiful spot. I mean, if you got the green grass, the blue Caribbean Sea, the rolling hills, it looks peaceful. It looks like heritage.
Heritage is such a tricky word, isn't it? It implies preservation. It implies something we value and want to keep. It suggests a certain, gentility.
Yeah, a clean version of the past.
But when you stand among those ruins, the foundations of the governor's house, the remains of the sugar mill, that unfinished church, you have to ask yourself what you are actually standing on.
The source material is very blunt about this. It calls the site a crime scene.
It is a crime scene, but unlike a modern crime scene with yellow tape, this one has been covered by 500 years of grass and, forgetfulness. The thesis we are exploring today is that Sevilla la Nueva was not just a settlement. It was a machine. It was a place designed to kill, not accidentally, but structurally.
Designed to kill, that's a strong phrase. That implies intent.
Or at least a callous indifference to life that functioned in exactly the same way. The architecture you see there, the limestone blocks, the layout of the town, it only exists because of 2 catastrophic events.
Okay.
The destruction of the indigenous Taino people and the introduction of the first African captives.
And that's why the title of this deep dive is First Town, First Chains.
Precisely. This specific geographic location is the hinge. It is where the indigenous world was ground down and the Atlantic slave trade in Jamaica began. They overlap right here on this spot.
So this town was the laboratory.
It was the laboratory where the plantation society was invented.
I want to push on that word laboratory. It suggests an experiment. Were they really testing things, or was this just, chaotic violence?
That is a great question. It wasn't a laboratory in the sense of white coats and clipboards, obviously, but it was a laboratory of systems. The Spanish were trying to figure out, how do we extract wealth from this environment? How do we control population that outnumbers us? How do we build a European city in the tropics? They tested legal frameworks like the Encomienda,
which we'll get into.
Oh, absolutely. They tested agricultural technology like a sugar mill, and the results of those tests, specifically the failure of indigenous labor and the pivot to African labor, that became the blueprint for the entire Caribbean.
So if Sevilla la Nueva hadn't happened the way it did, the history of the Americas might look very different.
It established the precedent. It proved that you could run a colony on forced labor, even if it meant burning through human lives at a completely unsustainable rate.
Okay, let's get into the timeline. We're dropping in at 1509. The Taino people have been on this island, which they call Jamaica, for centuries.
That's centuries, yeah.
They have a complex society, sustainable agriculture, a spiritual connection to the land, and then ships appear on the horizon. This isn't Columbus this time. This is Juan de Esquivel. Who is this man?
Juan de Esquivel is a different beast than the initial explorers. He isn't just looking for a route to China. He is a settler, a conqueror. He arrives with a mandate from Diego Colon, that's Columbus's son, to secure the island. And he brings with him approximately 80 Spanish families.
80 families. That detail sticks out to me. That's not a military garrison.
No.
That's not a group of soldiers living in tents. That's women, children, servants. That signals permanence.
It signals they weren't planning to leave. They were planning to transplant Spain onto Jamaica. They wanted to build a capital. And this is where the hubris just begins. They didn't want a trading post. They wanted a new Seville.
New Seville.
They wanted to mirror the grandeur of the city of Seville back in Spain, which was, the beating heart of the colonial enterprise.
So they look at this tropical coastline with its mangroves and its humidity, and they say, we're going to build a proper Spanish city right here.
And that means a grid, the traza. The Spanish were obsessed with the grid layout. Straight streets, a central plaza, the church on one side, the governor's house on the other.
Right.
It was an imposition of order, this European geometric order, onto a landscape they just viewed as wild and chaotic.
It's a psychological statement as much as an architectural one. We are bringing civilization to the jungle.
Exactly. But to build that grid, to raise those stone walls, requires immense physical effort. And Juan de Esquivel and his hidalgos, these minor nobles who considered manual labor beneath their dignity, they certainly weren't going to pick up a shovel.
So who builds the dream?
The Taino. And this brings us to the second chapter of our story, the construction of the town itself. We need to look closely at what this actually entailed.
Okay.
The ruins we see today are made of cut limestone and brick. Do you have any idea what it takes to produce that in 1509?
I'm assuming you can't just, order it from a supplier.
You have to quarry the stone from the earth. That means Taino men breaking rock with inadequate tools, maybe iron picks the Spanish brought, or just brute force. Then you have to haul those blocks, some of them weighing hundreds of pounds, to the site.
Without machinery.
Without machinery. But the real killer was the mortar. To make lime mortar, you have to burn limestone. You need massive amounts of wood to keep the kilns hot enough to turn rock into powder.
So they are clear-cutting the forest to burn the stone.
Yes. Deforestation begins immediately. The Taino are forced to cut the timber, haul it, feed the fires, and mix the mortar. This is heavy industrial labor.
Right.
And remember, the Taino economy was based on conuco cultivation, these mounds of earth for cassava and fishing. It was a lifestyle that required work, yes, but not this kind of bone-crushing, calorie-intensive exertion.
Their bodies literally weren't conditioned for it.
No human body is conditioned for 14-hour days of hauling stone in the tropical sun with no protein. And this construction wasn't just for shelter. They were building symbols of power. The governor's house, the ruins of which are still there, was a fortress.
It had to look imposing.
It had to say, I am in charge.
And the church, Peter Martyr's church.
That was an even bigger project. Peter Martyr d'Anghiera was the abbot, though he never once set foot in Jamaica.
He never even came.
Never. The church was meant to be a cathedral. Think about the ambition of that. They were trying to build a massive stone abbey in a place where they hadn't even secured a reliable food source yet.
It seems almost delusional.
It was fueled by this belief that God was on their side and, more importantly, that the labor supply was infinite. They looked at the Taino population and saw an inexhaustible battery of energy. They were wrong.
I want to zoom in on the sugar mill for a second. The outline mentions this as a key part of the laboratory. Why is a sugar mill so significant in, say, 1510 or 1515?
Because sugar is the reason for the season, essentially. It becomes the driving economic force of the Caribbean. And at Sevilla la Nueva, we see one of the very earliest attempts to industrialize sugar production on the island. This wasn't a modern factory, but it was a factory nonetheless. We call it a trapiche.
Describe the trapiche to me. How does it work?
Okay, so it's a mill with vertical rollers, usually made of hardwood or stone, sometimes encased in iron if they had it. You feed the cane stalks between the rollers to crush them and squeeze out the juice. Now, in later centuries, you might have wind or water power. But at Sevilla, in these early days, the primary power source was muscle.
Animal muscle.
Ideally, yes. Oxen or horses walking in a circle to turn the gears. But animals were expensive. They had to be imported. They died of disease. Do you know what is cheaper than a horse in 1510?
A Taino man.
Exactly. If the oxen died, or if they were needed for plowing, human beings were strapped into the harness. They were forced to push the beams in endless circles hour after hour. It's grueling, dizzying work.
And that's just the crushing.
That's just the first step. Then comes the boiling. This is where the industrial danger spikes. You have the boiling house, where the cane juice is heated in massive copper cauldrons to reduce it down to crystals. You have open fires roaring 247 during harvest.
I can't even imagine the heat.
You have boiling, sticky liquid that causes horrific burns if it splashes. The temperature in there would have been hellish.
So you're taking people who live in a tropical climate, forcing them into a superheated, unventilated stone room, and making them work until they drop.
And if they slow down, if they faint, that's where the coercion comes in. This wasn't a job you could quit. This brings us to the legal framework that justified all of this, the Encomienda.
Right. This is a word we hear in history class, but I feel like we often get a sanitized definition. The Spanish protected the Indians in exchange for labor. That sounds almost like a fair trade on paper.
That is exactly what the Spanish lawyers wanted it to sound like. It was a legal fiction designed to soothe the conscience of the king and the church.
Fiction.
The Encomienda system granted a Spanish settler, the encomendero, the right to the labor of a specific group of indigenous people. It did not technically grant ownership of the people.
And not slavery.
Not technically slavery. And it didn't grant ownership of their land. It just granted their sweat.
And in return.
In return, the encomendero was legally obliged to provide military protection and, crucially, religious instruction. They were supposed to save their souls by teaching them Christianity.
So, we are saving you from hell, so you must build my fortress.
That was the deal. But we need to look at the context here. This system was codified in the laws of Burgos in 1512. And those laws were actually the first written code of laws for the behavior of colonists in the Americas. They were technically meant to stop the abuse.
Yeah, stop it.
Believe it or not, they set limits on how many people could be held, they mandated rest days, they mandated food.
The laws written in Spain and reality in Jamaica are two very different things.
Precisely. In Sevilla la Nueva, thousands of miles from the king's inspectors, the Encomienda was a death sentence. The protection was a myth. Who are they protecting them from? The Spanish themselves.
Right.
And the religious instruction just became a tool of time management. You work from dawn until dusk, then you pray, then you sleep. It was total control.
And because the encomendero didn't own the people, like property, he didn't have a financial incentive to keep them alive for decades, did he?
That is a chilling but incredibly accurate economic analysis. In chattel slavery, which comes later, the enslaver has a capital investment in the human being. If that person dies, he loses money. In the Encomienda, the grant was often temporary or dependent on the governor's favor. If you have a grant of 50 Tainos for 2 years, your incentive is to extract maximum value from them in those 2 years. If they die, you just go ask the governor for a new batch.
It's a disposable workforce.
It created a perverse incentive for the rapid consumption of human life. And that is exactly what happened. The Taino population just collapsed. We are talking about thousands of people dying from exhaustion, malnutrition, and, despair.
Despair.
Yeah, there are accounts of mass suicides, of women refusing to bear children because they didn't want them to live in this world.
And this collapse creates a crisis for the Spanish. They have their stone city, they have their sugar mill, but the batteries are dying.
The machine is running out of fuel. And this leads us to the year 1513. This is a pivotal moment in our deep dive.
1513, the arrival of the first recorded African captives.
Yes. Just 4 years after the town was founded, we have records authorizing the importation of African slaves to Jamaica. Now, why? Why bring people all the way from Africa when you have a local population?
Because the local population is disappearing.
That's the primary driver, the labor vacuum. But there's also a racist mythology that's already developing here. The Spanish began to argue that one African was worth 4 Indians in terms of labor output.
Wow.
They believed Africans were hardier, partly because many Africans had some immunity to old world diseases like smallpox and measles, which the Taino lacked completely.
So they looked at the dying Taino and just said, we need a different kind of worker.
It was a cold, calculated business decision. And this is why we call Sevilla la Nueva the first chains. This is the moment the baton is passed. For a brief, tragic window between 1513 and 1534, you have a unique and terrible situation.
What's that?
You have Taino people working alongside African people in the same mills, on the same building sites.
That's an image we don't often see. We tend to separate the history. Chapter 1 is indigenous, Chapter 2 is slavery. But here, they are overlapping.
They are entangled. Imagine the construction site of the governor's house. You have a Taino stonecutter, perhaps carving one of those limestone blocks we see today. And next to him, mixing the mortar, is a man from West Africa, perhaps a Wolof or a Mandinka, who has just survived the Middle Passage.
Unbelievable.
They don't speak the same language, they don't share a culture, but they share the oppressor. They share the whip.
And they share the space. The archaeology supports this, right?
It does. When excavations were done at Seville, they found what we call middens, which are basically trash heaps. And in those heaps, you find a blending of worlds. You find Spanish olive jars next to Taino Yaba pottery. But you also find evidence of West African foodways beginning to appear.
So you can see it in the diet.
You see the genesis of Jamaican culture right there in the dirt.
It's the birth of a new demographic, born out of necessity for the Spanish, but surviving in spite of them.
But we have to be careful not to romanticize it. It was brutal. The Africans were brought in because they were movable property. This is the beginning of chattel slavery in Jamaica.
A different legal status.
A totally different legal status. The Taino were technically subjects of the crown under Encomienda, but the Africans were merchandise. This legal distinction set the stage for the anti-Black racism that would define the next 4 centuries.
So you have the Taino dying, the Africans arriving, the Spanish building their grid. But there is a 4th character in this story that we haven't fully addressed yet. The environment itself.
The mangrove trap.
Let's go back to that decision to build on the North Coast. You mentioned earlier it was a strategic choice, but an environmental disaster. Why?
The Spanish chose the site because it was near a Taino village, so, labor, and it had a beach, but they completely ignored the topography. Sevilla la Nueva sits on a coastal plain that is backed by hills, but right next to it are extensive wetlands, mangroves.
And in 1510, nobody knows about germs.
No. They believed in the miasma theory, that disease came from bad air or foul smells. They certainly smelled the swamp and they thought it was unhealthy, but they didn't understand the mechanism. They didn't know about the Anopheles mosquito.
Break that down for us. What is the Anopheles doing?
This specific mosquito is the vector for malaria. Now, malaria isn't native to the Americas. It was brought over by the Europeans and the Africans in their blood. But the mosquito was there waiting.
Waiting for the parasite.
Waiting for the parasite. Once it was introduced, the swamp became a breeding ground for biological warfare.
So the mosquito bites an infected person, then bites a healthy person, and boom, you have an epidemic.
Exactly, and the death toll was staggering. We have reports of pestilence sweeping through the town. The Spanish settlers were dying. Infant mortality was sky high. Whole families were wiped out. But just consider the impact on the laborers.
If a well-fed Spanish lord is dying, what happens to a starving Taino worker?
It's a massacre. A malnourished body cannot fight a fever. An exhausted body just collapses. The environment itself became a weapon of genocide. And here is the truly dark part. The Spanish authorities knew it was a death trap. They wrote letters complaining about the fevers, but they stayed.
Why? Why not move immediately?
Because of the sunk cost fallacy. They had already built the stone walls. They had already planted the cane. They had the mill running. To move would be to admit failure and to lose their investment.
So they tolerated the death.
They treated the loss of human life, especially indigenous and African life, as a line item on the balance sheet. It was simply the cost of doing business.
That is a terrifying mindset.
Okay.
It's the logic of the spreadsheet applied to human survival.
And this combination, the Encomienda overwork, the introduction of new pathogens like smallpox, and the malaria from the swamps resulted in the total depopulation of the area. By the 1530s, the Taino population in that region was effectively functionally extinct.
Functionally extinct. That phrase lands heavy.
It means that while individuals survived, mostly women absorbed into Spanish households or people fleeing to the mountains, the society was gone. The structure was gone. The silence in the hills was growing louder.
And eventually that silence became too much even for the Spanish.
By 1534, the situation was untenable. The town was a failure. The harbor was difficult for larger ships to navigate because of the reef. The disease rate was preventing the population from growing. And the gold. There was no gold. The dream of a new Seville had turned into a nightmare of mud and fever.
So they decided to pull the plug?
They petitioned the king to move the capital. In 1534, they received permission to relocate to the south side of the island to a place they called Villa de la Vega.
Which we know today is Spanish Town.
Right. And the logic for the move is telling. They wanted a drier climate, so less fever. They wanted better agricultural land for cattle. They wanted a better harbor. And Kingston Harbor is one of the best in the world. It was a pragmatic, logistical decision.
But what about the move itself? You don't just put a stone church in a suitcase.
No. And this is the most symbolic moment of this whole story. They stripped Sevilla la Nueva of everything valuable. They took the church bells, they took the furniture, they took the tools, they took the enslaved Africans, they took the remaining Taino servants, and they just walked away.
They just left the building standing there.
They left the stone carcasses. The unfinished church remained unfinished. The governor's house was abandoned to the vines and the roots. The jungle began to reclaim the site almost immediately.
And this is the crucial point, they took the system with them.
That is the key. They abandoned the location, but they did not abandon the methodology. The laboratory phase was over, and the experiment was considered a success in one specific way.
How so?
They had proven they could extract value using forced labor. They took the Encomienda model, they took the slavery model, and they replanted it in Spanish Town.
So Sevilla la Nueva was the prototype. It was the beta test. And once they worked out the bugs like don't build in a swamp, they rolled out the full production version in the South.
Exactly. The continuity of exploitation was unbroken. The ruins of Seville sat on the north coast as a ghost town, a monument to a failed settlement. But the spirit of Seville, the spirit of domination, marched south and it flourished. It evolved into the plantation system that would define Jamaica for the next 300 years.
I want to bring us back to the present. To, our listener who might be visiting the park this weekend. When you walk through those ruins now, knowing this history, how does it change the experience?
It changes everything. When you look at the governor's house, you shouldn't just admire the masonry. You should look for the carvings.
The carvings?
Yes, archaeologists have found stones in the structure that bear distinct Taino artistic motifs faces, zemi figures, but incorporated into Spanish walls.
Wow, so the Taino masons literally left their signature in the rock.
It's a form of resistance, or at least an assertion of presence. I was here, I built this. When you see those, you realize the walls are speaking. And when you walk on the grass, you have to remember you are walking on a graveyard.
A graveyard without headstones.
Thousands of people died in that small area. Their bodies were likely dumped in unmarked pits or simply left to return to the earth. The lush green grass of the Heritage Park is fed by that history. It is a place of profound mourning.
It redefines heritage. It's not just about celebrating the past. It's about witnessing it.
It's about bearing witness to the cost of the modern world. Because the wealth of Europe, the sugar empires of the 18th century, the global trade networks, they all started with these clumsy, brutal experiments at places like Sevilla la Nueva.
Before we truly wrap up, there's one detail I want to circle back to. We mentioned the laws of Burgos briefly, but I think we need to understand the intellectual climate that allowed this to happen. Was there no one in Spain saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't kill everyone?
That is such a critical question. And the answer is yes, there were voices. This is what makes the tragedy even worse. It wasn't done in ignorance. There was a fierce debate raging in Spain. You had men like Antonio de Montesinos, a Dominican friar.
Montesinos.
In 1511, so just 2 years after Esquivel landed in Jamaica, Montesinos stood up in a church in Santo Domingo, just across the water, and delivered a sermon that shook the empire. He looked at the encomenderos and he screamed, "Are these not men? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not obliged to love them as yourselves?"
Wow. That is bold.
It was revolutionary. He threatened them with hellfire. He told them they were living in mortal sin because of the cruelty of the Encomienda. And this news traveled all the way back to King Ferdinand.
And the king's reaction?
Well, the king was conflicted. He wanted the gold, but he didn't want to go to hell. So he convened a board of theologians and jurists. That's where the laws of Burgos came from. It was an attempt to regulate the horror. They debated these questions. Are the Indians free men?
And the answer was?
Yes, but they are lazy and need to be taught to work. Do they have property rights? Yes, but the Pope gave us the land.
Sounds like a lot of mental gymnastics.
It was the ultimate bureaucratic justification for genocide. They decided that yes, the Taino were free, but they had to work for the Spanish for their own good. It was paternalism weaponized. So when Esquivel is in Jamaica reading these laws, he sees the loopholes, not the humanitarian intent.
He sees I can make them work.
Exactly. And there was another document, the Requerimiento. Have you heard of this?
The requirement.
It was a legal text that Spanish captains were required to read to indigenous people before attacking them. It basically said, God created the world, the Pope leads the world, the Pope gave this land to the King of Spain, so you must submit to us.
And if they didn't understand Spanish?
It didn't matter. They would read it to the trees. They would read it on the beach before anyone was even in sight. They would read it at night. It was a ritual. Once they read it, if the Taino didn't immediately surrender, the Spanish felt legally justified in waging just war and enslaving them.
That is absurd. It's like reading a parking ticket to a wall and then towing the car.
It highlights how legalistic the Spanish conquest was. They were obsessed with legality. They wanted everything stamped and signed. That's why the records are so good and why we know so much about Sevilla la Nueva. They documented their own crimes meticulously.
So we've covered the arrival, the construction, the encomienda, the Africans, the disease, and the abandonment. It's a tragic arc. But why does this matter to us today, in 2026?
Which brings us right back to today. Back to you, the listener, standing on that manicured lawn at Seville Heritage Park.
It brings us to the emotional core of this whole story. When you walk there now, you see the governor's house. You see the ruins of the sugar mill. And the sign says, heritage.
But after hearing all this, that word heritage feels heavy. It feels complicated.
It should feel heavy. It's a complete paradox. We preserve these ruins, we cut the grass, we put up neat little signs. But in doing so, we often forget the dead.
Yeah.
We admire the architecture, the mamposteria, the masonry, but we forget the architect was fear. We forget that every single one of those stones was carried by someone who had a name, a family, a life that was stolen from them.
It's almost like the beauty of the park today is the final insult. It hides the violence. It makes it palatable for a vacation photo.
It sanitizes it.
Yeah.
Our job, and the job of the listener now, is to refuse to be sanitized. When you look at those stones, you have to see the invisible. You have to feel the weight of the ground under your feet. You are walking on a graveyard.
Reframing heritage. That's what we are doing here. We aren't saying don't visit. We are saying visit with your eyes wide open.
Exactly. Acknowledge the nameless, the Taino men and women, the first African captives from 1513. They are the true history of that place. The stones are just the debris they left behind.
It really changes how I see the entire North Coast. It's not just beaches and all-inclusive resorts. It's the ground zero of a world-changing tragedy.
But it's also the ground zero of survival. Because despite everything, despite the Encomienda, the mangrove, the whips, the disease, the spirit of the people survived.
It's true.
The Taino bloodline merged, the African culture took root, and it grew into something new and powerful. The Spanish moved the capital, but they couldn't kill the resistance. The Maroons, the ancestors of modern Jamaica, their story starts in the chaos of places exactly like this.
And that connects us to the bigger picture, to the whole Atlantic world.
It does. If we just connect the dots, we see the trajectory so clearly. Taino extinction created a labor vacuum. That vacuum sucked in the African slave trade. Sevilla la Nueva was the hinge where that terrible fear swung open.
First chains.
First chains. And those chains stretched across the Atlantic and bound the Caribbean for centuries. But understanding where they were first forged, right there in the mud of New Seville, that is the first step in breaking the silence.
And that silence is what we are trying to break with this deep dive. We are trying to give a voice back to the people who were silenced by the stones.
That is the power of history. It's not just about what happened, it's about remembering who it happened to.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground today. From the deceptive beauty of the park to the arrival of Esquivel, the horror of the Encomienda, the arrival of the first Africans in 1513, and the eventual abandonment of the town.
It's a heavy story, but a necessary one.
And it doesn't end here. Spanish moved to Spanish Town, but the story of colonization in Jamaica has another major chapter, a chapter about a colony that often gets forgotten in the shadow of the British takeover later on.
That's right, the forgotten colony. That is a whole other deep dive.
And we are going to go there.
We absolutely are.
But for today, we want to leave you with that image. The ruins of Sevilla la Nueva, the silence, the grass, and the ghosts underneath.
Remember them.
We want to thank you for listening to this deep dive on the ABENG signal. If you value this kind of history that digs deep, that doesn't shy away from the hard truths, then please keep the signal strong.
Subscribe, share, keep learning.
We will catch you on the next deep dive into the forgotten corners of our past.
Bye. Bye. See you on the next episode.
Bye. See you on the next episode.